Hello everyone, this is Dr. Mikolaj Rashek from Genomics, and I'm making this video for an update on the different scientific information I dug up on the new mRNA vaccines. So there's a couple points I wanted to make in today's video. Number one, I wanted to actually tell you briefly about one of the scientific papers I read that was brought to my attention by my editor, and that was the fact that it was recently discovered. This paper I think came out in late last year, and it showed that the receptors to which spike proteins that are normally found on the surface of the virus, when they bind to the receptors found on our human cells, they actually transform those receptors into being able to communicate and send signals inside the cells. That's not a normal behavior of these receptors. In fact, these receptors normally are not receptors. They are enzymes, meaning they actually have a specific catalytic function, and what they do is they regulate the pH of blood. But with this particular virus, the virus actually uses it as a receptor in order to enter our cells. But what was discovered is that upon binding to these receptors, they actually propagate signaling down inside the cell, and as a consequence, it results in certain type of communication inside the cell, and that can actually turn on specific genes and so on. So this is still something we need to be able to figure out in detail as to what kind of communication is being induced upon binding of such receptors by spike proteins. And the reason why is because when you take the mRNA vaccine, the purpose of the vaccine is to temporarily transform the cells, your cells that take up the vaccine, to resemble the virus by being able to put the spike protein on its surface. At least that's my understanding. And that means the surrounding cells will have receptors to be able to interact with these spike proteins that we will transiently express. And we still need to understand what will be the long-term consequences between such cell-to-cell interaction. So that's something that is still novel. I will keep looking for the scientific information, and we'll see what we find. The other information that I wanted to talk about is a database that is publicly available, which actually tracks the different side effects that are observed in a population upon vaccination. And this type of database, it's VAERS. It's been set up 30 years ago, and it was set up precisely to ensure that if there's any potential problems with vaccine, that this can be immediately tracked and uncovered. And this database is basically anyone can leave information in that database. And before I continue, it needs to be stated that none of that information is actually verified. Those are just simply reports that doctors or patients can put on into the database themselves based on their personal reaction to vaccines and what they think is their reaction to vaccines. And that's what I mean, that it's unconfirmed, because it's unknown whether the reactions themselves are to vaccines or not. But nevertheless, the database exists, and it's been in existence for 30 years, tracking information for all of the different vaccines that are being used in our treatments. And I checked that database a couple months ago. There was absolutely nothing related to COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, and now there is. Within those 2 months, approximately 13,000 different side effects have been notified in that database, and that is approximately 2% of all of the different side effects ever recorded within the span of those 30 years. So this is quite significant. It's a lot of different side effects. Now, side effects, usually when you say that word, it conjures up an image of something really bad. They can be very, very mild. So something like arm pain in your arm will still be recorded as a side effect. Even when I was looking at the databases, there are side effects. Crying is a side effect, but it can be also very severe stuff, and that includes death. What's interesting is that according to that database, and remember, this is not confirmed, so we don't know how accurate that is approximately 500 deaths have been now attributed to the new mRNA vaccines. And this is only American database. This database is maintained by CDC in the US. So what are we talking about with 500 potential deaths? So if we were to assume that these are actually all real, which cannot be said with any certainty at the moment, then what's interesting is that it would make this vaccine one of the deadliest vaccines ever created. And the reason why is because in over the span of 30 years, only 2,300 deaths approximately have ever been recorded in that database for all of the different vaccines. What that means is that, number one, vaccines in general are extremely safe. So it's interesting because this database sometimes used by what are referred to as anti-vaxxers to show how dangerous vaccines are, when in reality it actually leads to another conclusion. Vaccines are very safe and at least highly unlikely to ever die from vaccine. What's unusual about this COVID-19 is that approximately 20% of all deaths ever recorded in that historical database are now attributed to COVID-19. But nevertheless, if we were to assume that, let's pretend that all of that is accurate, well, we're talking about 15 million people in US have already been vaccinated. So that would mean, if this information was correct, approximately one person would die upon 100,000 vaccinations. So that's far, far more than the current approximate estimate of maybe 2 people dying for every 100 people who get infected with SARS-CoV-2. Now, of course, none of that information is truly reliable, including the statistic I just mentioned to you, how both how infectious and how deadly the disease is, because none of that information is also completely accurate, because it's not necessarily true that if a person gets a diagnosis of COVID-19 from PCR tests, that they truly would develop COVID-19, and whether all deaths attributed to COVID-19 can truly be attributed to COVID-19. But let's assume that that is correct. The point here is that if these vaccines were to be indeed as dangerous as this database would suggest, they are still multiple-fold less dangerous than the disease itself. Nevertheless, why do I bring it up? I bring it up for 2 reasons. Number one is that because a lot of doctors still don't even know that this database exists, and Canada has its own version, I believe. And that's important because we are undergoing experimental use of vaccine right now in the population. So it's important that doctors know that this database is available, and it's very simple to be able to put in a report. And number 2, at some point, if these numbers of side effects, including deaths, continue to rise, we do have to know what our trigger point is as to when that information does have to be investigated to determine that these vaccines might potentially be unsafe. So far, looks good. Also, all of the scientific information I was able to find that tested the effectiveness of these vaccines, they clearly show that those patients who were vaccinated, they do produce antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, so that's also very good news. I will continue monitoring this information, including that database, and will give you updates, but definitely check it out. There's lots of information to be gleaned from that. And once again, it's VAERS database, VAERS, I believe. You'll be able to find it on Google easily if you type it in, VAERS and CDC database. And while at first it might seem overwhelmingly to go through it, it's actually fairly intuitive once you get a hang of it. So check it out, and that's it for today. And on cue, Kat leaves the video. Bye everyone.